partners. Aren't you listening? I'm starving. It's time to eat.
Star Wars Outlaws was Ubisoft's attempt at creating the first ever open world Star Wars game. One that was meant to allow a seamless sense of exploration both in space and on the planets that you land on. A scoundrel's tale was what the game's initial premise was, allowing players to live out the life of a lawless criminal whose loyalty and time can be bought and sold at a price. It was quite an ambitious project and was meant to be one of Ubi's biggest. After all, the company is largely known for its Assassin's Creed and Far Cry series. Outlaws would have been a shift from that usual Ubi game. Massive Entertainment, the team behind the popular Division series, led the development of this game. And with support from 11 other Ubisoft studios, there was at one point nearly 600 developers working on the game. With those kinds of numbers, I think it's fair to say that Ubisoft had some very large expectations and had made a substantial investment in its development. The game ended up releasing to what I would consider underwhelming reviews given the development cost and original premise. It now sits at a 75 on Metacritic for its PS5 release. Not good, not bad, pretty average. I personally never really did have any interest in playing Star Wars Outlaws, so I didn't read any of the reviews or watch any of the videos. For me, it was just another Ubi game and not something I was really interested in at the time. And that's not to say I don't like Star Wars games. I mean, on this channel itself, I reviewed Jedi Survivor, which I found to be pretty good, but nothing overly amazing. Outlaws was a game that seemed to release and was forgotten about rather quickly. I mean, Star Wars is a large IP. Whenever a game releases in that universe, there's usually quite a lot of discussion revolving around that game, but this time around, I didn't really hear or read much. I guess maybe I just wasn't looking in the right places. Anyway, I did end up purchasing the game a couple of weeks ago. It was on a pretty big sale, and I was pretty curious about the open world and reputation system that the game had touted. Also, the game has received a number of updates since its launch, so I figured this would be a perfect time to give the game a shot. So in this video, this is everything I have to say about Star Wars Outlaws, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's start with a short introduction to our main character. Kay is somewhat of an amateur thief who's lucked out by being recruited to take part in a heist that is so good that it would easily make her dream of moving off planet and starting a new life a reality. Unfortunately for Kay, the heist isn't what it seems. Instead, it's a rescue mission for a rebel leader that in turn leaves Kay betrayed and left with a death mark on her head by Slero, the game's main villain. This sets up the rest of Kay's story, how she ends up needing to form a team to pull off what would actually end up being the biggest heist ever, and removing her death mark for good, allowing her to move and live freely. This premise I feel like offered Ubisoft a chance to move away from the typical Ubi formula, the open world, checklist-filled formula that has become commonplace for over a decade at this point. Unfortunately, this doesn't end up being the case at all. Outlaws ends up hitting the bullseye of the usual Ubisoft style, with the only truly different thing about the game being its setting and its reputation system. I mean, as I was wrapping up my playthrough with the game, I had this sneaky thought creeping in the back of my mind about how Ubisoft just keeps making the same exact game over and over again. Now, I want to get into the reputation system. The game is heavily built around it, and this was a large part of Ubisoft's marketing campaign and was a main selling point. See, in Outlaws, there are 4 different groups that are part of the Underworld Criminal Network, these being the Pike Syndicate, the Crimson Dawn, the Hutt Cartel, and the Ashiga Clan. Each of these 4 different groups calls a different planet home. For example, you'll find the Ashiga Clan stronghold on Kijimi and the Pike Syndicates on Toshara. Reputation in the game is, of course, very fickle. It can be built up by accepting and completing contracts for a certain group through their contract brokers, and it can be broken down by doing things such as simply trespassing in a group's district or by making big decisions that would hurt them in some way. The reputation system sounds like a really cool idea at first glance. However, the system ends up sort of just feeling like a basic surface level feature. Let me explain. Each criminal group has a meter whose relationship can range from terrible to excellent. As you move up the bar, the more rewards you get. The more freely you can walk around the group's district, you'll get better deals at merchants, you'll have access to better jobs, and you'll even gain access to charms and gear. This is pretty cool, right? I mean, I'm being rewarded for showing my loyalty to a group. What more do I want? Of course, the equal and opposite is also true. If you get on the group's bad side, you'll find yourself getting shot on sight, merchants won't give you any deals, and the jobs you get offered won't be anywhere near as good. The thing is, no matter how much you make a certain group hate you can always earn their trust back and eventually form the best relationship with them. I get why Ubi has it set up this way. They want to have it so that a player can always get all the gear and rewards in the game. But personally, I think there should have been an additional bar on the screen that comes before the terrible rating, where basically you get locked out of that group's job offers and makes the relationship with them irreparable. If I just double crossed and betrayed your group for the 5th time in a row, then what reason does your group have to trust me? There should be some sort of permanent consequence to my constant bad behavior. In general, of course, you want to be on a group's good side since there is obviously no downside to being so. Eventually, you can max out your reputation with each group despite making decisions that hurt one group and help the other. Being on their good side also makes missions a lot more easy, especially if you're expected to go in with stealth. At times, you'll take on missions that require you to infiltrate a group's district in order to uncover some plan or stop some sort of corruption, and if you're in good standing with these groups, you can simply just walk into the district and freely explore until you get near your objective. Even then, despite having the best relationship possible, for some reason, once entering these districts, Kay will sort of slouch as if she needs to sneak around in the area. It's kind of weird. This is all to say though that there really isn't a rhyme or reason as to why you would pick one group over the other. Unless you find some exclusive cosmetic or item that you want right away, then the game naturally just has your reputation going up and down between these different groups. Truthfully, none of this even matters for the main plot. The reputation system and this whole group thing is in its own silo and sort of its own sub-game. Your reputation doesn't affect any of the main plot in any shape or form. It would have been interesting to see the group that you had the best relationship with integrate with the main plot somehow, outside of a very small cameo towards the end of the game. Anyway, let's move on to gameplay. So I think gameplay is best broken down into 3 different parts, those being stealth, gunplay, and space combat. I'll start with the easiest of them all, that being stealth. Now I know Star Wars Outlaws was originally meant to be a stealth game, which sort of just contradicts the very name of the game, but anyway, the thing about stealth in Outlaws is that it's a game-breakingly easy, and that's without any upgrades through abilities or loadouts. Enemy sightlines are so short that I'd often be taking down one enemy while clearly in the direct line of sight of some enemy that's not too far off in the distance. The problem with stealth in this game is that it's just simply not respectable. It's too easy, and more often than not, I would breeze through these stealth areas without worrying too much about enemies' positioning or the path they take. I never sat there and carefully plotted my routes the way I have done in countless other games. Not sure if my opinion of stealth being easy is even an outlier. It doesn't seem to be. Before writing my review, I was doing some research on the different opinions players had about stealth in the game, and honestly, it seemed pretty split down the middle. Some players find the stealth very easy, others find it too difficult. I'm not sure what the driving factor behind the difference in opinion is, but I'm definitely on the easy side of the fence. Outside of a few moments in the early game, I never really felt challenged by stealth. The existing stealth mechanics in Outlaws are what we've seen in just about every Ubi game for the past 15 years. Enemies can be attracted with a whistle like we've seen in the AC games, but the problem with the whistle mechanic in Outlaws is that it's so loud, it just ends up attracting multiple enemies in an area to your location. You also have your usual ways of sneaking from cover to cover and from bush to bush. Takedown animations are fine for the most part, but it's clear to me that Kay has to have the strongest fist on any planet if she's able to punch enemies on their helmets countless times without breaking her hand. The one sort of new mechanic is that you can use your companion Nyx to distract enemies, and this can even be upgraded so that it can distract multiple enemies at a time and from a further distance. Regardless of these abilities, their existence is pretty pointless given just how bad the AI is. I would use Nyx's ability every now and then, but knowing I can simply punch a guard out despite another being just feet away and not even notice was far easier and quicker to do than using my whole arsenal of abilities. I honestly question whether or not guards can even hear things. There were more than a few times I'd break out into a whole fist fight with one enemy and a nearby enemy wouldn't even even realize that their coworker just got beat up. It's clear the game was designed to be one where stealth is often the key approach, but given how badly the AI is implemented, it just makes the whole stealth aspect feel very unserious. For the record, I wasn't playing on story or on normal. I did my playthrough on the outlaw difficulty, which is 2 steps below the hardest, but given the fact that this difficulty is meant to be harder than normal, it was surprising how easy the stealth gameplay still was. I can't speak for the hardest difficulty, but that was my experience on Outlaw. Now the gunplay was definitely a step above the stealth gameplay. Since this game was developed by Massive Entertainment, the studio behind the Division series, it makes sense that it ended up being as solid and as fun as it was. Thankfully, I picked this game up after a few updates were made, making gunplay a more optimal solution when approaching mission areas. As K, you have your blaster, which serves as your primary weapon to take down enemies at a range. The blaster also comes equipped with 3 different ammo types, those being plasma, ion, and power. Within these modes, there's another layer of choice, this being what kind of firing type you want to use. For example, the plasma blaster has a light, rapid, and heavy firing modes. This ends up modifying how the weapon controls and how much damage it does, essentially treating the plasma blaster as a regular pistol, a submachine gun, or a revolver of some sorts. It's a smart and very creative way to offer up the player a number of options to choose, all just within one weapon. Now the actual gunplay feels good. Hits feel chunky and impactful. The different firing modes have a nice and unique kick to them. Aside from just using the blaster though, you can pick up a number of different weapons from fallen enemies, from snipers to rifles to grenade launchers. Each of these different weapons also feel unique and are genuinely fun to use. I was pretty surprised at just how good shooting felt in this game. The game was legitimately much more fun when approaching combat aggressively as opposed to the stealth approach. I'm not sure if this will be an unpopular opinion, but they probably could have removed the stealth component from the game as a whole. But given the fact the game follows the typical UB formula, it makes sense that there's a stealth component and a combat component for most missions. Now it's worth mentioning that when the game first came out, a lot of these missions had stealth as a requirement rather than as an option. Getting caught would basically restart the mission as if the game came out 20 years ago on PS2. Thankfully, this has since been changed, allowing players to approach combat the way I did, and that's mostly with guns blazing. I'd be interested to know what the reviews would have looked like from the very start if missions didn't have an automatic failure state when a player was caught outside of stealth. Anyway, this is all to say that I found the gunplay far more better than the stealth aspect. Space combat also exists and it gets the job done. I spent the least of my time in orbit, so I didn't experience much of it, but what was there felt fine. It wasn't fun enough to keep me in space longer than I needed to be, and there's this whole targeting mechanic which plays similar to other space combat games you might have played. You sort of aim ahead of an enemy in order to score a direct hit. You have a few different weapons at your disposal. You can use a missile for big damage if you lock onto a target long enough, or charge up your shot. I don't really have much of an opinion on the space combat, so I'll keep this section limited, but to me, what was there felt good enough. Anyway, let's start with the open worlds now of Star Wars Outlaws. So in total, there are 4 different locations that you can visit, those being Kijimi, Tatooine, Akiva, and Toshara. These 4 locations all have a unique vibe and look to them, and I like this quite a bit. There is a clear distinction between traveling through the planet of Akiva and its tropical rainforest-like atmosphere, as opposed to Tatooine and its sprawling deserts. What's interesting about these areas is that Ubisoft decided against using procedural generation to create these environments, and instead just chose to handcraft them. And you know what? It definitely shows. The environments just flat out look great. The main cities are populated with NPCs going on about their daily routines, and just walking around these areas is really immersive, and you can spend a lot of time just walking around, talking to various NPCs, interacting with the arcade machines, and more often than not, the NPCs you do end up talking to might have a bit of intel for you when you least expect it. Now you would think there being 4 planets mean 4 open world areas to traverse, but that's actually not the case, as Kijimi just ends up being a city to run around in, rather than a large open world area that can be traversed via your speeder. Each of these planets ends up being somewhat of a battleground between rivaling factions that you'll often get in the middle of. The 3 planets that have the open world areas do end up feeling quite identical despite being visually far from it. In typical open world game fashion, there are a number of points of interest that you'll come across as you make your way from mission to mission. These points of interest normally will have a few treasure chests, and I thought these treasures would have something cool or extremely valuable, but what they normally end up being are just parts for crafting. Now, getting to these planets is done via space travel. It's not as seamless as UB or players would have likely expected, as moving from planet to planet is done via a menu system that allows you to pick an orbit to move to. This is followed by activating your hyperdrive, and off you go as you warp through a loading screen. Each planet does have its own orbit where you basically do the same thing that you would do on the planet. This boils down to visiting points of interest in orbit, which can be a crashed ship or some cargo, and blow it up to gather some loot. Now, getting around on these planets is of course done via the speeder, which in my opinion controls pretty badly. Not only does it feel super loose, but it generally feels clunky to use. Sometimes when you're on your speeder, you'll get chased down by a faction you've done wrong or something, and to my surprise and disappointment, you can't even free aim on your speeder to pick off enemies. You have to use this adrenaline mechanic to manually target enemies and kill them that way. That's pretty lame, to be honest. It would have been much more fun to free aim and control where I place my shots instead. The open world is where the game starts to feel like another Ubisoft game, which can be good or bad depending on who you ask. For me, this is bad. I don't want to basically play Assassin's Creed or Far Cry in space, but that's kind of what the game just ends up being. Go to this point of interest, loot it, eliminate enemies if necessary, then move on to the next area. I get that I'm being purposely obtuse here, but I would have definitely liked Star Wars Outlaws to have been an opportunity for Ubisoft to innovate in some form or fashion. But the game does nothing innovative at all in its open world design. One thing I did like were the dynamic events that seemed to take place from time to time where Imperials would hunt down some stolen cargo by pirates, which would result in a firefight between the two groups. This also gives you a chance to swoop in and take the loot for yourself. These events seem to exist on every planet, but overall it's unfortunate that the game really doesn't deviate from the formula more. Now let's talk about the mission design. Just about every mission in the game will have you sneaking in or infiltrating some base or area that you're not supposed to be in. As you might have guessed, this is usually done via stealth. Throughout a mission, you'll have to perform a number of different tasks. These usually include slicing through a terminal to open a locked door or drop an energy barrier, and using your data spike to open locked doors and containers, primarily staying out of sight while doing all this. Now, the slicing minigame sort of ends up like playing Wordle, where you have to match a pattern, and the game tells you which symbols are in the right place and which ones need to be moved. The data spike minigame took me stupidly long to figure out. Basically, you're supposed to follow the beat that plays and press R2 at the same time, but man, this took me way too long to get used to. Now, this same loop holds true for just about every main mission. Now, there are some areas where the game actually expects you to be in combat and use your weapon, and I've said this before, but this is where I feel like the game is at its absolute best. But for the most of your time in a mission, if you want to do things cleanly, you'll likely have to be doing it through stealth. To the game's credit, the level design is pretty well done. The game offers up a number of different ways to approach a mission, from different entry paths to small vents that can take you to locations that seem somewhat unreachable. Now, the game does this thing where it gives you hints on what action you should take next, and this is done with these yellow identifying marks that can range from arrows pointing to a certain direction or indicating which ledges are clearly grabbable. This type of game design is more controversial than I had expected. Some people really don't want to be told what to do and would rather figure out the correct route on their own, while other players actually like these small hints and clearly marked paths. After coming off Jedi Survivor, where I had to constantly open my map to see what the heck I had to do next, I found this type of level design to be somewhat refreshing. Yes, it was super easy for me to get around, but the platforming areas in this game are meant to be challenging. Now, the contract broker missions that you go on for these different criminal groups pretty much follow the same sort of design, but at the end of most of those missions, you'll be offered a chance to really destroy your relationship with one group and improve it with another. I purposely decided to destroy my relationship with the Crimson Dawn because I just didn't like them, but for some reason, their leader was still friendly to me despite my attempts at making them really hate me. Let's talk about progression. Now, progression in Star Wars Outlaws is done in a pretty unique way. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy what the development team has attempted here. Let's start with the experts. In total, there are 9 experts who offer up to 6 skills of their own abilities that can be unlocked. Yes, that sounds like a lot, but a good chunk of these abilities are not very game changing. I won't go through each of these skill trees as badly as I would like to, but essentially each expert offers up some ability that ties into that particular expert's specialty. For example, the mercenary grants Kay the ability to pick up advanced weaponry, allowing her to wield weapons she wouldn't be able to otherwise. There's another ability that makes it so that weapons that Kay picks up come with extra ammunition. Some expert abilities do overlap, like 2 different experts offer up health increases and extra stim charges. The way to unlock these abilities is what I ended up liking quite a lot. There isn't any leveling system in the game. Instead, after completing an expert's mission for the first time, you're exposed to the abilities that they offer. If you want any of those abilities, then you can follow the checklist that you need to complete in order to unlock that ability. For example, in the Gunslinger skill tree, if I want to increase my maximum health, I'll need to defeat 5 enemies while at low health and defeat Imperial forces while at wanted level 3. If I do these 2 things, then the ability is mine. It's a genuinely good system that doesn't rely on some arbitrary XP bar to fill up. Some abilities will have you hunting for parts in the open world, which is a great use of the existing open world and giving a reason for the player to go out and explore. Not sure if I'm in the minority here, but I like the progression system here quite a bit. Kay also has a loadout that affects the game. To start, she has 3 different pieces of gear such as the jacket, the belt, and the boots. These items offer up a small or large buff depending on the gear's quality. For example, you can find the superior item that gives you stronger buffs and also can be part of a set. Completing the set gives you the set bonus. These items can change up your playstyle, whether you're focused more on stealth or taking combat head on, you'll likely find a set for it. There's also the charm system, which grants you passive buffs. These buffs range from making Nyx more ferocious in combat to not consuming back the vials when healing. Clothing and charm system kind of go hand in hand in crafting a style of play that you're more interested in, but overall the gear system is fairly basic, and to be honest, I was surprised the game even had one. It's a Ubisoft game after all, so I guess it would be an anomaly if it didn't. Aside from Kay, all of her gear can be upgraded as well. These speeder upgrades are pretty surface level. All they really do is offer up speed upgrades and damage reductions. There really aren't any upgrades for the speeder that changed anything substantial about it. The existing upgrades are just incremental buffs. The Trailblazer does have more substantial upgrades, and since it is also a weapon, its upgrade paths are similar to your blaster. You can unlock different missile types, cannon types, and turrets, and you can upgrade your defenses along with your speed of travel. The upgrades for the Trailblazer are nice, as they do change up how your ship behaves in combat, going from quick shooting lasers to charged up shot. It really ends up depending on which style you feel most comfortable with. This upgrade tree is actually very similar to your blaster. I spoke about this in an earlier section, so I won't dive too deep into it again, but basically you can upgrade your different firing modes to make your gun more accurate, easier to handle, or changing the fire types that are available to you. This is all to say that the progression system is well done. Despite some upgrades that are very surface level, some do end up being quite useful during gameplay, and the process of unlocking these upgrades was something I liked a lot. I think if Ubisoft continues to go down this path, they'll eventually strike gold with a fun and engaging skill system. Alright, let's get into the side activities. I decided to have a separate section for these side activities because the game offers up such a large variety of them. Let's start with Sabacc. This is meant to be Outlaws card game, similar to what you've seen in other open world games that have started this trend of attempting to include an addicting card game. Unfortunately, Sabacc misses the mark for me. I didn't end up really liking the game all that much. The objective is clear, and while it seemed like it could have been fun, after playing more than a few rounds, I ended up dropping it pretty quickly. Luckily, if you do end up liking the game, there is an expert who has a couple of skills to help you cheat in the game. There's also these horse races, basically, which are more often than not fixed. Basically, you can bet on a winner, and if you're correct, you get a small payout. As I mentioned, these races are normally fixed, so if you listen around the cantina or gather some intel, you'll be in the know. This activity is kind of bland. Like, if it is fixed and you know who's gonna win, then you're pretty much watching for nothing. There's also this whole food eating minigame, which I found overly annoying. It can be turned off, but I was surprised to even see that something like this even exists. To sum it up, you buy yourself and Nyx some food, which leads to this QTE driven cutscene. It goes on for far too long, and there's genuinely no reason for it to even exist. There are other side activities, such as speeder racing, where you go up against another racer for some credits, and there are a wide variety of contracts and intel that you can gather that will take you all over different parts of the 4 different planets. This is all to say that there is quite literally an insane amount of things to do in Star Wars Outlaws. Repetition, however, does start to kick in after some contracts, but you'll have to grind those anyway if you intend to have a good relationship with all the different crime groups. Now, let's talk about the story a little bit. The story of the game revolves around Kay Vess, a common thief who had been recruited to take part in the heist that would allow her to move off planet and basically start a new life. The heist goes off smoothly for the most part, except that she quickly learns that there wasn't a pile of credits waiting for her, but rather a rebel leader named Asara. Kay is betrayed and left behind by the rebels, leading to a run-in with Sliro, the leader of a rising syndicate known as Zarek Besh. Sliro puts a death mark on Kay as she makes her escape, leading to Kay having a bounty on her head. To counter this, Kay is approached by Jalen, a man who happens to have a plan to pull off the greatest heist the universe had ever seen. This heist, however, requires a number of different crew members who specialize in a few different things. This basically sets in motion the driving force behind the story. As Kay, you'll travel from planet to planet with the goal of finding and saving these crew members who have their own issues that need to be dealt with prior to being recruited. This is pretty much the same concept for all the crew members. You rinse and repeat this 3 times times until you have all the members of your party. The story is otherwise nothing special. There are betrayals after betrayals to the point where you kind of expect to always be betrayed. Nothing unexpected really happens, and Kay never even really grows as a character. Who she is at the beginning is basically who she is at the end. And to add to that, we never even really learn much about the various characters. Each of these crew members are really ever known at a surface level, so there's no real emotional connection there. Kay herself is a pretty bland character, as we do get some tiny glimpses into her past, but again, there's just no depth into who she is or why things are the way they are. All we know is that she was abandoned, she was an outlaw, and she wants to leave her home planet. Outside of some small interactions with crew members throughout the main campaign, we never really learn much more about them other than what's in the codex. Now, the main villain is also pretty run-of-the-mill. He's a rich bad guy who runs the criminal underworld and also has his own motivations and secrets. Overall, the story was really just okay. Like, there's never a sense of urgency, never a sense of doom. All the reveals towards the end weren't shocking or unexpected. Now, let's talk about performance. Performance-wise, the game was just okay. I played on my PS5 and found that at times I experienced some clearly visible frame drop. This most commonly happened when I was running around the big main cities. You can see that there is a clear drop in how smoothly the game runs. The game runs pretty well otherwise when roaming around the open world, but also experiences some drops in big firefights with lots of explosions. There is this weird blurriness that can often be seen when traveling around on the speeder. There's also a fair amount of pop-in. Graphically, the game is really just a mixed bag. The environments look pretty good, the interior and the open world carry the game quite a bit, but the player models just don't look good at all during gameplay or conversations. Kay, as well as her companions, have this weird plastic look to them, the lip syncing is off, and just looking at Kay's hair, we can see some blurriness around it. I get that performance mode drops the game's quality output, but I was surprised just to see how blurry and bad it would get at times. I don't want to upgrade to a PS5 Pro because I find it pretty pointless, but if games are going to constantly be this bad looking in performance mode, then it might be something I have to consider. Now, there have been a number of updates since launch, and these updates were made to overhaul the gameplay. I mean, they quite literally changed the structure of the game, removing the forced stealth missions and allowing players to approach them how they see fit. They also made it so that Kay isn't constantly dropping her picked up weapons whenever she performs an action, such as climbing or hacking. Now, the funniest part about this whole thing was that I saw a commercial for this game not too long ago, and on the splash screen, it had the words, "Now with improved gameplay." If this is the improved gameplay, then I can only imagine what the original looked like. All right, I think I've went on this video for a pretty long time, but I just want to get my thoughts out. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. I really want to like Star Wars Outlaws. I really wanted it to be something other than Assassin's Creed or Far Cry in space, but that's exactly what it ends up being. It's the same formula over and over again. Open world, sneak around an enemy base, approach the mission, kill or use stealth, loot the set base, and then leave. It would have been nice if UB tried something new for once, instead of just another game that takes the base UB formula and slaps a Star Wars skin on it. That's not to say the game doesn't do things well, because it genuinely does. The gunplay, as I mentioned before, is very well done, and how you go about unlocking abilities is also very cool. But things that were supposed to be the main selling points, such as the reputation system and the open world, just end up being duds. The reputation system ends up just being a very surface level thing and just another way to do missions and get cosmetic rewards. The benefits of being in good standing with the syndicate are fine, but you can't really make enemies. No matter how much you betray a group, you can always get back in their good graces. The open worlds, for the most part, look amazing, and that's great, but they end up being copy and paste of what we've seen before with the usual points of interest. I didn't walk away from the game feeling like I played something that was groundbreaking or new. Instead, I felt like I played another generic open world game for the 50th time. I honestly didn't go into Star Wars Outlaws with high expectations. I instead went in with a curious mind, asking myself if Ubisoft did something different here, did they pull off anything new? And the answer, to be honest, to those two questions was no, they didn't. As far as whether or not I would suggest buying the game, then honestly, I'm not sure if I would recommend the game to anyone outside of those who are basically hardcore Star Wars fans. Star Wars Outlaws should have been amazing, but instead, it's just average. That's going to wrap it up for me. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button. I'll see you all in the next one.